Welcome to Sunday worship at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Burlington, Vermont. I'm John Sallée, a member of the First UU Worship Associate Team, and this is the worship service for May 30th, 2021. This meeting house, which we humbly acknowledge has been built on unceded Abenaki land, serves as a sacred gathering space for the members and friends of this congregation and all who hope for and commit to creating a world of kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity for all beings. You are welcome here, and we are grateful for your participation in this worship. Unitarian Universalists acknowledge that the divine can be called by many names, each insufficient, but approaching fullness when in conversation together. So we are committed to divinity as process and as a presence in our community, regardless of how we each name it. To learn more about our faith, our meeting house, or our society and its activities, you can click the link on YouTube or explore our website, uusociety.org. Let us know you're visiting. We welcome the opportunity to welcome you personally.
Let's light our chalice. We kindle this chalice flame to remind ourselves of the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment. Today's call to worship is Memorial Day Sonnet by Garrison Keillor. We're here to honor those who went to war, who did not wish to die but did die grievously. In 1861 and in 2004, though they were as peaceable as you or me. Young and innocent, they knew nothing of horror, singers and athletes, and all in all well-bred. Their sergeants mercifully made them into warriors, and at the end, they were moving straight ahead. As we look at these headstones, row on row on row, let us see them as they were, laughing and joking, on that bright, irreverent morning long ago, and once more let our hearts be broken. God have mercy on them for their heroic gift. May we live the good lives they would have lived.
Good morning. You know how sometimes when a story ends, it feels so satisfying? Other times you wish the story would never end and just keep going. Today we share more of a living story. This book is written, but the story is far from over, and the story aligns with our own sixth principle: world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. This is Lillian's Right to Vote by Jonah Winter with illustrations by Shane W. Evans. This story continues to be written. I wonder what Lillian would have to say today. A very old woman stands at the bottom of a very steep hill. It's voting day. She's an American, and by God, she's going to vote. Lillian is her name.
It's a long haul up that steep hill when you've been alive for 100 years, when you've lived the life that Lillian has, and walked so far in her shoes. When Lillian looks up, it's more than the blue sky she sees. She sees history.
Lillian sees her great-great-grandparents, Elijah and Sarah. They are standing side by side on an auction block. Sarah is holding their baby, Edmund. They are being sold as slaves in front of the very same Alabama courthouse where rich white men and no one else are allowed to vote. Lillian starts her slow climb. Though the sun shines brightly, Lillian sees a dark time from years long past.
She sees her great-grandpa Edmund, now grown. He is owned by another man, forced to pick cotton from daybreak to nightfall, right here in this country where it was written that all men are created equal. He sure doesn't have the right to vote. In fact, he doesn't have the right to do much at all, until after the Civil War, which will end slavery.
As Lillian inches up the hill past one neighbor's house and then another, she sees her great-grandpa Edmund on his way to vote for the first time, thanks to a law that was passed in 1870. The law is the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says that American citizens' right to vote
shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Even though the law does not allow women to vote, Great-Grandma Ida is with her husband. Lillian feels their dignity and their pride as they enter that courthouse for the first time. As Lillian continues, the hill gets steeper and steeper. She sees what happens just 20 years later, right here in Alabama. That's her grandpa Isaac at the courthouse, being charged a poll tax to vote. He doesn't have money to pay. So much for that 15th Amendment and Grandpa Isaac's right to vote. Lillian pauses to catch her breath, hearing the voices of her Uncle Levi. He is telling her about those tests that he was forced to take when he tried to vote.
How many bubbles in a bar of soap?
His lips grow tight as he recalls being asked to.
Name all 67 judges in the state of Alabama.
And being turned away when he failed to answer such questions. As Lillian pushes on, she sees a brave girl standing next to her mother and father as they try to register to vote. The year is 1920, and the 19th Amendment has just passed, a law allowing women to vote. The girl is Lillian herself with her mama and papa. They are being chased away by an angry mob. There's Mr. Bentley, the barber, and Mr. McCrory, who owns the ice cream shop. She feels the grip of her mother's hand as they run through the streets back home.
Though today the birds are singing and people smiling, Lillian sees in vivid orange and brilliant red the cross burning on the lawn of her girlhood home, set aflame by the same angry mob just because her parents want to vote. This is something she will always see.
Lillian stops in her tracks. unable to keep going as she sees herself trying to register to vote for the very first time. She sees the blank piece of paper on which she must write down a section of the U.S. Constitution, word for word, as it is being mumbled by the registrar, a test she could not pass. No one could. "Are you going to vote?" she asks a young man she passes on her way home.
"Yes, ma'am."
"You better." She means it. Lillian sees the funeral procession for a man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old shot by a policeman over nothing more than taking part in a peaceful protest.
It is March 1965. All he wanted was justice and the right to vote. Looking up to the top of the hill, Lillian wonders how she will make it. It looks so far. She is so tired. Though her feet and legs ache with 100 years of walking, what fuels her ancient body is seeing 600 people beginning a peaceful protest march from Selma to Montgomery.
People who, though they don't know it yet, will be stopped on a bridge by policemen with clubs. All they want is justice and the right to vote.
At the front is future Congressman John Lewis, whose forehead will always bear the scar from where he was beaten. As long as Lillian has a pulse, she keeps on climbing, keeps on seeing, this time the second march from Selma. This march also ends on the bridge in a prayer led by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whose dreams of justice for African Americans are already famous. Wherever he went, he lifted people up, and his words still lift Lillian. Footstep by footstep, she keeps on going. Just as the marchers keep on through the cold and rain, finally making it all the way to Montgomery on their third march,
She sees them all: Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, rabbis, priests, and 25,000 others. She can still hear Reverend King asking how long they would have to wait for justice. She can still feel the power of his voice when he says,
"Not long."
As she takes those final steps to the top of the hill, she can hear the voice of President Lyndon Johnson on her TV saying,
"Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is not duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. All of us must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome."
Before Lillian walks through the doors of the building,
Where you better believe she will vote.
she looks up and sees the same blue sky.
Brighter than any she's ever seen.
She saw it on August 6th, 1965.
The day the president signed the Voting Rights Act, the one law protecting all Americans' right to vote in every state and every town, the one law protecting Lillian as a full-fledged citizen of the United States.
She enters the building and sees herself stepping into the voting booth in 1965 for the very first time. She knows she would not be standing here today were it not for the people who marched and the people who died for her right to vote.
Lillian touches her finger to the lever, and because she is a citizen of the United States of America, protected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Lillian pushes that lever.
Lillian votes.
Having entered worship, we once again center our intentions to offer and lay bare our joys and sorrows on the altar of divine community. Sorrow and concern for my dad, who was hospitalized for several days last week. He's home now, but his diagnosis is still unclear, and he needs support navigating a more restricted lifestyle. Not all joys and sorrows can be confined by words, and fewer can be spoken, and fewer still spoken publicly here. Please join me in holding those offered spoken and unspoken, known and unknown, in our collective meditative embrace. May the joys and sorrows of each be the joys and sorrows of all, reminding us of our shared humanity.
We're tenting tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, a song of home and friends we love so dear. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. We've been tenting tonight on the old campground, thinking of days gone by, of the loved ones at home who gave us a hand and a tear that said goodbye. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. We are tired of war on the old campground. Many are dead and gone, of the brave and true who left their homes, others been wounded long. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. We've been fighting today on the old campground. Many are lying near. Some are dead and some are dying. Many are in tears. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. Dying tonight, dying tonight, dying on the old campground.
If you were preparing a talk for Memorial Day, what would be your first thought? Mine was to remember the people who served in the military that have been a part of my story, especially the grandfathers. Then the people I know who served more recently, even now, and eventually to remember that this day is not about veterans or service members, even if they've passed. While it is right and good to appreciate those folks all the time, this day is for those who lost their lives on the battlefield. With that squared, I asked myself, as UUs often do, why? Why do we have a day to remember them specifically? And why should it be separate from Veterans Day and Armed Forces Day? Those questions invite me back to interrogate that first thought. I remembered my grandfathers. People who came back, told their stories, worked jobs, raised families, lived lives. Their stories and their service live on in mine, and also in my memory, my name, and my very existence. So today gives us, the living, the benefactors, an opportunity to remember the ancestors, not of biology, the ancestors of our freedom. I know that Unitarian Universalism has a complex relationship with military service. Our history includes a significant number of ministers and members and congregations that have been explicitly pacifist, whether it was about a specific war or for their entire lives. The sixth principle enjoins us to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. But we don't have the all but given pacifism of some other traditions. The 2010 UUA Statement of Conscience, Creating Peace, states that it is grounded in 8 UU theological principles, one of which is rejection of moral dualism. It says, "We reject as false the sharp separation of good and evil, refusing to assign individuals and nations into one category or the other. In the midst of ambiguity, we can build peace by cultivating the goodness in ourselves and others." Our faith honors conscientious objection and military service alike. 2 strong, active interpretations of how an individual might affirm and promote the 6th principle. Because for Unitarian Universalists, the exercise of individual conscience is holy work. However we as individuals discern that our commitment to peace should be lived, we must first acknowledge that Unitarian Universalism is firmly rooted in the context of the U.S., both historically and currently. It could not have been planted or grown into exactly what it is in any other time or place. Our faith tradition is inextricably linked through the celebration and assertion of our freedoms to the battles and the warriors which secured them. It was just 2 years ago when I first recognized the call to serve and had to wrestle with my own complex relationship with military service. I recalled and was inspired by the words of advice offered by our family's minister some years ago, which became and has remained the most succinct way I know to summarize that complexity. She said, "We all hope for a world that doesn't need warriors. Until then, we pray for wise warriors that want to make that world possible." So pray for these wise and brave warriors. Prayer can look different depending on who is doing it. It most often serves as a bridge between the divine and the manifest. The wise warriors that we mourn today and every Memorial Day that have sacrificed their lives on the altar of freedom, they bridge that gap. And it is a special kind of prayer to recognize those lives and to tell those stories that were sacrificed for us, that have yet to be told to or by a grandchild. And I have one vital word of caution. To claim an ancestor to my freedom and tell their story is not an exercise in history. History is collective recognition. This is not a roll call. because a list is not enough. This is not about all. This is about an individual. This memorial is specific and personal. Thucydides said, "The bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding go out to meet it." This Memorial Day, find an ancestor. Learn the name of a brave and wise warrior. Hold the story of their vision, and then meet them.
Where did Memorial Day come from? I talked about this last year, though it seems important to me to recall this story every year. It's a true story. Happened in Charleston, South Carolina in May of 1865, as the Civil War was just coming to an end. Some, I don't know how many, Black citizens of that town who were newly freed from slavery by the end of the Civil War buried 257 bodies of Union soldiers who had died in a Confederate prison camp in the city in a mass grave. They dug them up. They honored them with reverent burials in gratitude because, of course, it was the fighting of those soldiers that made the people who had been held as slaves free. It took them 2 weeks. And then there was a parade. 10,000 people marched and sang and celebrated, and they were led by 2,800 Black children. This was not really the beginning of Memorial Day. That was not formally in any way established by the government until 1868, when May 30th of every year was declared Decoration Day. But informally, all over the country, the parts where the war had happened, there were local memorials, both north and south. And notably, in many cases, those memorials honored both those who had died who were Confederate soldiers and those who were Union soldiers, no matter where the ceremony happened. This is the kind of ceremony that has happened in many places around the world for hundreds and maybe thousands of years, when people gather to remember and to honor those who died in war. 3 years earlier than that event in Charleston, Julia Ward Howe wrote the poem, which became the hymn, which became the song that so many of us know and have sung all our lives, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fatal lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Julia Ward Howe was a poet and a writer and a lecturer and a social reformer. She is perhaps most remembered for the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was first published as a poem in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. She wrote many books, including collections of poetry and travel volumes, and along with women such as Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she led the movement for women's suffrage. She advocated for prison reform and for international peace, and she was a staunch abolitionist. Julia Ward Howe was raised in privilege in New York City. Her father was a prominent banker. Though she never had any formal education, she was taught at home. She started writing as a child, and she continued her reading and study her whole life. After her father died, and then a brother and a sister-in-law, she turned to the religion of her upbringing, Episcopalian and Calvinist, and then she did more study about religion. And later she wrote, "I studied my way out of all the mental agonies which Calvinism can engender and became a Unitarian." She married the much older Samuel Gridley Howe, who was a physician and a teacher of the blind. Julia and Samuel clashed over her suffragist activities, but both of them found slavery repulsive. She wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic in 1862. It was during the war, and there are various stories about how this happened, but it's clear that she heard a troop of soldiers, Union soldiers, who were singing the dirge, "John Brown's Body." She felt the power of their singing, but the irreverence of the lyrics just felt wrong to her, wrong for such an important cause as ending slavery. So someone suggested when she complained about those words that she write some new lyrics. She wrote a poem filled with biblical references that expresses the hope that God will help the Union army to victory, so slavery would be ended. The story is that President Lincoln cried when he first heard it. "He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on." A 100 years later, almost exactly 100 years later, our country was, of course, at war again against the people of Vietnam. This is the war that shaped my adolescence and young adulthood. I learned a great deal about the war and how we got into it. I was ardent in my opposition to the war. The truth is, I don't know much about war. The stories that I have heard from my relatives who served in the military were minimal. I perhaps was not curious enough. I know something about reverence. I don't know much about war, and so I need to draw on the wisdom and the prophecy of those who do, those who have lived through war themselves. And one of those from that war I grew up with, the Vietnam War, one of those prophets is Tim O'Brien. You, I'm sure, have heard of his book about the Vietnam War called The Things They Carried. In 1990, he wrote a magazine article about, and he called it How to Tell a True War Story. I want to read some of it to you right now. The truths are contradictory. It can be argued, for instance, that war is grotesque, but in truth, war is also beauty. For all its horror, you can't help but gape at the awful majesty of combat. You stare out at tracer rounds unwinding through the dark like brilliant red ribbons. You admire the fluid symmetries of troops on the move, the harmonies of sound and shape and proportion, the great sheets of metal fire streaming down from a gunship, the illumination rounds, the white phosphorus, the purpley black glow of napalm, the rocket's red glare. It's not pretty exactly, it's astonishing. Like a killer forest fire, like cancer under a microscope, any battle or bombing raid or artillery barrage has the aesthetic purity of absolute moral indifference. A powerful, implacable beauty, and a true war story will tell the truth about this, though the truth is ugly. To generalize about war is like generalizing about peace. Almost everything is true. Almost nothing is true. At its core, perhaps, war is just another name for death. And yet any soldier will tell you, if he tells the truth, that proximity to death brings with it a corresponding proximity to life. After a firefight, there is always the immense pleasure of aliveness. The trees are alive. The grass, the soil, everything. All around you, things are purely living and you among them. You feel an intense out-of-the-skin awareness of your living self, your truest self, the human being you want to be and then become by the force of wanting it. In the midst of evil, you want to be good. You want decency. You want justice and courtesy and human concord, things you never knew you wanted. Freshly, as if for the first time, you love what's best in yourself and in the world, all that might be lost. At the hour of dusk, you sit at your foxhole and look out on a wide river turning pinkish red and at the mountains beyond. And although in the morning you must cross the river, and go into the mountains and do terrible things and maybe die, even so, you find yourself studying the fine colors on the river. You feel wonder and awe at the setting of the sun, and you are filled with a hard, aching love for how the world could be and always should be, but now is not. How do we remember the wars and those who fought and died? How can we be reverent of life and of death, those of us who did not fight, who did not die, but live and must not turn away from this truth that is ugly and beautiful? How must we stand, be, live in the middle of that contradiction and turn ourselves toward the beauty that we wish for us and the world? How do we do all of that at once? I turn to another prophet of our own tradition. The Reverend Kathleen Mctigue is the founder of the UU College of Social Justice. In the early 2000s, when our military was fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, she served as minister of the Unitarian Society of New Haven, Connecticut. And she wrote this reflection. What's in a name? Always there is a story. You were named for a beloved relative or contrarily named after no one because your parents wanted a clean break from family history. Your parents might have named you for their favorite Spanish or Italian village. Perhaps you carry the name of one of their heroes or heroines or some musician or movie star. Maybe you've ended up with an affectionate nickname born of a sibling's mispronunciation, or some jackass thing you tried as an adolescent and never lived down. Always there is a story. In church on Sunday mornings, we read aloud the names of the American soldiers killed in Iraq or Afghanistan each week. Alone in my study the night before, I speak each name aloud and then wonder about the stories. I imagine these soldiers as the babies they once were, held in someone's arms at a baptism or a naming ceremony, the proud relatives gathered around as the name was formally bestowed and everybody beamed. There was so much gladness and pride in each moment of naming, and not once did anyone imagine that the road their baby walked would end 18 or 20 years later in a mix of blood and dust halfway around the world. As part of a Witness for Peace on Memorial Day, a cairn of stones was built at a busy downtown intersection in Hartford, each stone bearing the name of a fallen American soldier or one of the tens of thousands of Iraqi and Afghani civilians who have died in these wars. How do you choose one name from thousands to symbolize so much carnage and loss? I finally brought 3 stones to the cairn, one for each of my own 3 children. Each stone bore the name of a child who had died on the birthday of one of mine. As I placed the stones, I wondered about their names. Always there is a story. Let us remember. Let us not forget. Let our hearts be broken again and again so that we may be hopeful in those broken parts, against all evidence to the contrary, hopeful that warriors may be peacemakers, that the stories of peace and justice for the whole world, stories we dare to imagine, may one day be true. So may it be. So may it blessed be.
Today's offering will be shared with the Josh Pallotta Fund, whose mission is to ensure our nation's warriors receive whatever help they need, even if it is just time with others, to manifest the vision of a world free of veteran suicide. They recently opened Josh's House, a place for veterans, current service members, and their families to find peace and connection with one another, to learn life skills and enjoy recreational activities. There is also a meal train sign up that we've provided. Meals can be cooked at home and dropped off, or cooked at the kitchen at Josh's house. With gratitude, we dedicate these gifts in the service of our mission to inspire spiritual growth, care for each other and our community, seek truth, and act for justice.
We extinguish our chalice flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and share with the world until we are together again. Our benediction today is from the work of the Reverend Tom Shade. He writes, "My friends, there is a power at work in the universe. It works through human hands, but it was not made by human hands. It is a creative, sustaining, and transforming power, and we can trust that power with our lives. It will sustain us whenever we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we root ourselves in peace and justice, whenever we take a risk. Trust in that power. We are together, held by that power. Go in peace."
Thank you.